Welcome to part two of our board spotlight series. I'm Wesley Liu and I serve on the Youth Advisory Board of the California Association of Youth Courts. Today, I'm joined by Noah Block, a board member of the California Association of Youth Courts. Before I begin, I want to note that the board spotlight series is really a chance to get to know the people behind the California Association of Youth Courts and to understand what drives them to do what they do. So let's get started. My first question to you, Noah, is where are you from and what is your favorite childhood memory?
Thank you, Wesley, for the invitation today. I really appreciate it. I grew up in Marin County in California and lived there my whole life in a town called San Anselmo, which is a small community, small suburban community there in Marin. I think one of my favorite childhood memories was when my young brother was born. He's 2 years younger than I am, and I went into the room as a toddler myself, um, after my mother had just given birth, and she handed me a Woody doll from Toy Story. Um, and well, after I got that toy, I had no problem with my brother because I knew I would be getting toys still. So that was an easy win for me.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great story. My second question is how did you end up working in juvenile justice?
Well, that's a long story, and it starts off with in Marin. I'll move back to my childhood years. I was as a young man or young boy, about fourth grader, experienced a lot of torment and bullying in my life, and a lot of that had to do with my learning disabilities. A lot of that had to do with um, not being the most, I enjoyed book learning. I enjoyed reading. I also enjoyed talking to new people and trying to be, sometimes an eclectic kid. And as that young person, what I really found out, or language that I found later in life, is that bullying, really what people who experience it, bullying is something that is a loss of power, loss of control over themselves and their life. And while that was happening, I got really depressed and very anxious, and later got diagnosed with PTSD from that experience. And really, ultimately, though, got really disconnected, really angry with my community. And because the people in power, positions of power, teachers, administrators, community members who had abilities to do something about it, when I reported it, chose not to. And so I saw how many places in our community choose not to support the people who need protection and need help. Moving forward into middle school, I saw that come up again with my school counselor. My school counselor was an incredibly important person in my life at that point when I was having all of those challenges, as they continued up into middle school. And the school district, instead of encouraging that, supporting that, they actually eliminated the school counselor position in favor of interns. And I just saw how, I finally found an adult in my life who I could really trust in the school system, and the school system took her away from me. And so I organized around that issue in middle school, went to the school board, had a petition drive, and brought some of my friends who had similar experiences to say how this wasn't right. And instead of the school board looking at that, they voted unanimously to make that cut. One of the questions a parent said in the room that day was, what would it take? Does a student need to die for you to understand that mental health services are important to young people? And I think that is what it took, because the next year a student did die by suicide. And they brought that counselor back. So those experiences really taught me how many of the systems and structures that we have in our communities are not always set up to support people who need it. And then cut to high school, continuing to feel very angry, isolated, confused, and also seeing how a lot of the people, like my friends who were in similar experiences to me, who were also angry, isolated, confused for lots of different reasons, racism, to poverty, to household challenges, family instability, turn to substances, turn to drug and alcohol, turn to what we maybe consider, poor behavior, to cope with those issues that they're having in their life. instead of the school system, the police, law enforcement, so, giving them support services like counselors, they chose to criminalize those young people, my friends, suspend them, sometimes expel them. And even as a young person, I saw that being deeply wrong. So part of my mandatory community service that I had to do in high school was volunteering. And so I chose to get involved with what was then called the Marin County Youth Corps. And I really saw in that space how, one, the things I had experienced were not right. And two, that there was an ability to be different, and to do things differently, and that there were different approaches to the problems that we saw, and that there were adults in my life or in the community who were working to change that. And so I got involved in that work, ended up continuing to do work in my community in school districts around mental health services. Ultimately went to college in Baltimore, and majoring in peace and conflict studies and American studies, looking at this politics of social change, and working in Baltimore City schools there. And then coming back to this community, back to my hometown, an area, and continue to work on that with the California Association of Youth Courts, and multiple different organizations around the country, training with them and for them, around juvenile justice issues, restorative practices, social determinants of health, mental health and mental illness. There's an important distinction there, and how all those issues intersect with each other. We a lot of times think of these things as different, but really it's just different lenses to think about these issues. And then ultimately got involved and got connected to a group of young people in Mendocino County, which is north of, it's a very large but very rural county in Northern California, just north of Sonoma County, where I currently live, who is interested in starting a program like this. And we know, me working at the state, that these programs do not generally find themselves in rural, low-income communities, particularly of color, particularly tribal or indigenous communities in the country, let alone California. And so I was really interested in that approach. And about a year ago, accepted a position supporting those communities and actualizing and making the program happen that they wanted. That program is now called the Restorative Justice Youth Council. And we just celebrated our year one. And it was, great. It's been a great experience working with the community there thus far.
Yeah, it seems like ideas like justice, compassion, and right and wrong. Well, these are great adjectives, but it's interesting to see how they play out in your life and how you went from the victim, the recipient of it, to being someone who dispenses it, who works for it. And this brings me to my third question of what drives you to do what you do.
Yeah. I think for a lot of the people that I work with, and I include myself, I think of less as victims and more as survivors, as people who've persisted despite the challenges that we've experienced in our own lives. One of my favorite quotes is, the most common way you give up your power is thinking you don't have any. And I think that's a really relevant quote for a lot of our young people who feel like they're powerless to their situation. And that's on a lot of cases due to adults telling them and showing them that they don't necessarily have power that they can make happen. So yeah, that would be.
Yeah. My final question for you, Noah, is more of a practical, forward-looking question of what do you envision the future of juvenile justice to be like?
Yeah. I see juvenile justice, it is already shifting, right? We've closed our juvenile prisons in California. We've looked at how trauma, childhood trauma, and also adult trauma and generational trauma impact our young people in our communities. And we've also moving towards seeing how we can support rather than the negatives or the poor behavior, look at how we can help the young person heal. Look at what are those root causes of the challenge. And so that's really where I see juvenile justice and the justice work moving towards is making sure that we're centering and really focusing on those root causes of the behavior rather than the behavior itself, and looking at how we can have a whole community wrap around this child. Like, we talk about how it takes a village to raise this child, but what does it really mean for the government, for a county, for a probation department to actually make that possible, to actually have a system of supports across a county, across a state, across a nation that truly work together collaboratively to support all young people, not just the few who have the resources to do that.
Yeah, I find your answer both impactful, but also insightful into what an ideal juvenile justice system, what an ideal idea of justice, the ideal idea of a state and a community should be. And I certainly, when you said those words, I was thinking back to the California Association of Youth Courts motto, justice for youth, by youth. And I was thinking of how much that has resonated to you personally, but also to so many youth who are watching this interview today, who would be inspired or touched by your story and who might see similarities to yours. So what do you have to say to those young people out there who might be going through something similar to what you had gone through, or who are looking to again impart those ideas of justice, of community, of compassion, of community service? So what do you have to say to those young people watching today?
Yeah, I thank you for that question, Wesley. I think there's a common quote and thing we say to youth, and I've heard it many times in the past too, that it gets better. And while I appreciate the mantra and the idea, I don't know as much if it gets better more than you learn how to ask for the help you need and find the people in your life who can support you when you're having those challenges. The challenges as growing into adulthood is become more complicated and more difficult and less black and white as you get older. But the ways in which you're able to find those people that care for you and care about you can become easier over time, and you learn to trust. But ultimately, though, that requires you and your friends to ask for that help, to reach out, particularly for our young men. That can be really difficult to talk about needing help and needing support, while young women are more likely to have a false or have a failed suicide attempt. Young men or men generally are much more likely to complete the act of suicide. And I think that's because a lot of our young men don't know how to ask for that help. And so there's a real crisis to make sure that we're able to support all young people. I always encourage folks to call the 988 number, the National Crisis and Suicide Lifeline. Those supports can be invaluable. Your teachers, your staff at schools, not maybe everyone might be the most supportive, but there are folks in the community. It might be the librarian, it might be your janitor. But there are people in the community that do want to help. It's just about finding them, which may take some time, and it can be really hard. As someone who dealt with that for years, it is a really difficult challenge to have, and I understand that, and those people do exist.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we are a community, and there are people who want to help. So ending on that happy note, I wanted to thank you, Noah, for joining us on this session of Board Spotlight. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Wesley. Take care, everyone.